Good afternoon and welcome to a conversation with our guest, Niamh Kerr. I'm Suzanne Marshall and this is my colleague, Sandy McLean from CDN College Development Network. Hello Niamh, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself, where you work and what your role is?
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. I am the Training and Education Coordinator for Universities and Colleges at Rape Crisis Scotland. My post is part of the Equally Safe in Colleges and University work that is ongoing, and it is a national post that supports the strategic development of the sector's work around gender-based violence. So that's a bit about me, and I'm really excited to be with you today. Thanks again for having me.
Okay, thanks, Niamh. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you've been working with colleges and universities in your role?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working really closely with universities and colleges to support them to engage with their local rape crisis centres in particular, and to implement staff and student education programmes, as well as improving availability to vital support services for survivors and in particular student survivors. So a big part of this work has been around the Equally Safe in Colleges and University 3-tiered first responder training programme for staff across the sector, and this is done in partnership with local rape crisis centres and other multi-agency partners, including domestic abuse charities, mainly Women's Aid and also Police Scotland. So normally that work would be carried out face-to-face, and that's a 3.5-day training for staff, but that has changed a little bit recently, which I'll talk to a bit later on today. But many members of staff across institutions have now received either levels 1 and level 2 of that training, or have received all 3 tiers of that kind of first responder training. So we've got quite a lot of staff members across the country who are now trained up to be first responders to people disclosing instances of gender-based violence. And another big part of my work is also around kind of student engagement, student education. So that looks like kind of peer education programs for students. But more recently, we have launched our student e-learning module, which 30 institutions have so far expressed interest in. And I think about like 25 have now implemented that, which is really exciting. So hopefully we should have quite a lot of students starting to take that module as well. And it'll be interesting to see what feedback we get from that when that comes. So yeah, that's a wee bit about the role.
Yeah, thanks, Niamh, that's great.
That's great, yeah. So how you alluded to it earlier, but how has the lockdown and all the COVID restrictions impacted on your work?
I think it would be fair to say that initially it had quite a significant impact on the work. We were kind of, I'm sure, as everyone can relate to, waiting to see how long this was going to last. So, our kind of, we maybe paused for a while, deciding whether or not we were going to adapt the education programs for online learning. We have now adapted them because it does look like face-to-face training is not going to resume for quite a long time. So level 1 and level 2, or tier 1 and tier 2 of the first responder program has now been adapted. And that has been adapted into 3 webinars. So they are generally about 2 to 2.5 hours per webinar. And we are now in the process of adapting tier 3 as well. So again, we'd kind of paused on that with the hope that we would be able to complete tier 3 in a face-to-face setting, but once again it looks like that could be quite a long way off. So we are now I'm now working quite closely with Aid and Police Scotland to see what we can adapt and what that might look like for online learning. Yeah, it's been an interesting process. I think like a really kind of positive, if there is such a thing, of this situation is that I've been able to connect with people that I maybe wouldn't have been able to connect with as easily in the past, without having to travel quite far. So I think that that's been really great. Like even being able to do this interview today, I think that really speaks to, the situation we're in and how much more accessible some things are. And the way that we can kind of work with people has maybe changed quite a lot, which I think will hopefully have positives going forward as well. Yeah, lots of adapting has been happening over the last wee while.
Thanks, Niamh. You might have answered part of this next question, but it was to give us an idea of what's involved in the training. You've said broadly in relation to the webinars and the sort of response you've been getting, having to move into this online mode. So I don't know if you have any more detail you can give us on that, Niamh.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it might be helpful for me just to speak a little bit to what the training covers.
Yes.
And I think, that's quite useful as well for institutions to get a sense of like who each kind of level is for. So what I would say is level 1 of the training is an essential kind of gender-based violence awareness raising training. It includes like definitions of what gender-based violence is, the impact that maybe like societal attitudes around gender-based violence can have on survivors, the impact more generally that gender-based violence can have on survivors, and then a bit of an introduction to how you would respond to disclosure, but it's by no means kind of as in depth as the later levels. So that kind of level 1 is suitable for staff in any role. It's quite a sort of accessible awareness raising session. And then level 2 is more kind of advanced gender-based violence awareness. So I would say that this is more suitable for staff who are in kind of student-facing roles, sort of frontline facing roles where they might be quite likely to receive disclosures or to be that kind of supporting staff member. So level 2 is a lot more in-depth. It covers the criminal justice system. That takes quite a big part of level 2, as well as kind of trauma and coping, how people kind of cope with trauma, what that looks like, what trauma-informed practice might look like within an institution, within a team, and as well as kind of talking a little bit about kind of vicarious trauma and the impact that hearing disclosures can have on staff members and the importance of boundaries. And then again, kind of further, a bit of further kind of training on how to respond to disclosures and some kind of really practical elements to that session as well. And I would say that even though this is now being done online, they are still very interactive. That's something that we've kind of really, I think that's really kind of key to this training, that people have the opportunity to ask questions, to clarify things that might be unclear, to kind of speak to their own experiences in cases that they might have already kind of dealt with or supported with. So that is something that we have kind of tried to keep in as much as possible. And then level 3, which again is just in the process of being adapted for online learning, but that kind of would generally be an input from a domestic abuse service, most often Women's Aid, around kind of domestic abuse. And in particular, what that looks like for students and young people, and that sometimes not being a term that young people might identify very well with, especially if they're not living with their partner. That kind of idea of domestic might not really sit with them. So with the kind of online adaptation, we're really trying to make sure that it feels kind of really appropriate for institutions, and that it's kind of a really kind of helpful way of framing it for staff and students. And then also in that kind of level 3, we hope that there'll be an input from Police Scotland, I guess, just about a bit more into what the reporting process can look like, as well as an input from the institution themselves, so that somebody from, whether that's HR or staff or student wellbeing services, kind of coming in and having a chat about kind of what policies and procedures might be relevant in these kind of situations. And to answer the end of your question, I would say that feedback has been overwhelmingly positive of the webinars. Yeah. Which is something that I, if I'm honest, I was like a wee bit apprehensive about kind of how this was going to go, what it was going to look like. And actually, I think that they've gone well. And I think people have, I definitely acknowledge kind of Zoom fatigue and being on training for long periods of time about difficult subjects, can be really hard, but that actually, people are kind of able to fit it into their day in a way that they might not have been able to if it was a whole day of training, because it's a bit more condensed. So yeah, so far so good. The feedback has been great, but yeah, we are always kind of looking for feedback. Any and all feedback is helpful at this stage. So yeah.
Niamh, just one thing on this. What are the numbers that you'll take in an online webinar?
So I think, yeah, that's a really good question. And what I would say, because this training is either kind of delivered directly by the local rape crisis centre of the institution, or kind of coordinated by me, delivered by me and that rape crisis centre, it might depend on what that rape crisis centre is you know, kind of what their capacity is. I've kind of been saying about 25 people as a maximum, just because, as I mentioned, it is very interactive, and I think with more than that, you kind of lose some of the participative elements sometimes. You know, people are just not having a chance to speak. So yeah, and with some of the groups, we've actually had really kind of small groups, which has been nice as well. So I think, yeah, I think probably a maximum of 25 is good for the kind of participative elements. But again, because this might be done directly through a rape crisis centre, a local rape crisis centre, they might have slightly differing kind of numbers.
Yeah, and would the platform vary as well, whether it's Zoom or?
It could do, yeah. I think, and that's something, you know, we can be quite flexible about. We've been using Zoom so far just because it's the technology that I'm the most familiar with. But yeah, I think that there's definitely kind of flexibility around that for institutions and for local rape crisis centres as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Niamh.
Thanks.
Great. And finally, to pick up on something that you said earlier, I imagine, you know, this type of training can trigger all sorts of emotions in participants. So could you tell us really a bit about how you're managing to hold a safe space digitally for people?
Yeah, I think that that's such an important question, and I'm really glad that that's being asked today, because it's definitely something that I suppose it's something I think about quite a lot when I've been delivering training, or when I've been kind of coordinating the training, and I think it's probably just really important at this stage to acknowledge that this training, and any training on gender-based violence, can affect people in a massive kind of range of ways, and for a variety of reasons. And I think, you know, that is something I would always acknowledge at the start of a training as well. You know, I suppose some kind of really practical things that we would do is, you know, providing national support information before the session even starts, so that, you know, if anything is coming up for people, they know that there's this helpline that's available to them, either kind of personally or in a professional capacity, if they need support around anything. And I think that that can be just, you know, quite a helpful sort of basis for that. But also, we would always take the approach that there will be survivors in the room. And I think that, you know, and not to assume that you might know if somebody is a survivor or not, or that I might know, because I certainly wouldn't. Another big part of what we would do before the session would be to kind of establish a bit of a group agreement. And I know that sometimes that can feel a bit, maybe it's a bit harder online, you know. In person, there's maybe a bit more kind of collaboration there. It's a bit easier, but actually I think it's just as important, if not more important, to be kind of trying to foster that sort of safe space online as much as possible, and so that people can kind of say what they need from a space, and yeah, so that would be something that I'd always be trying to establish at the start of a group as well. And also, you know, really kind of, I suppose, quite simple things, but Zoom allows people to do what they need to feel safe in a lot of ways. Like, you can turn your camera off if you're feeling uncomfortable, which is a lot harder in person. It's much harder to walk out of a room than it is to sort of shut your camera off, or, you know, stand up and go for a cup of tea if that's what you need to do. And you know, we would always be trying to make sure that that people know that that's okay for them to do. If they need to take breaks, you know, also I'm hyper aware that people also have a lot of caring responsibilities at the moment. So there might be multiple reasons that people need their camera off or need to run out of the room at any moment. And that's okay. So I think that that's another kind of key thing. And I suppose what I'd also say is, like, ultimately we cannot prepare for how something might affect us. You know, I think you can do all the safety planning as a facilitator or as an individual, and sometimes this training can catch people off guard, or it can trigger a response that they weren't expecting, even if they are quite aware of what their own safety feels like. I think sometimes, you know, something can come up, and that, you know, it hits you in a way that you might not expect it to. And I suppose as a facilitator, you know, I and all facilitators would always try to be kind of sensitive to that reality. But I think also acknowledging that sometimes that just happens, and for people to really kind of focus on self-care. The other thing I would say, and I always say this at the end of sessions, is, like, I'd love for people to be able to just take some time for themselves after the session. And I do appreciate that is not always possible, especially the sessions, you know, first thing in the morning, and people already have, you know, their work day planned out for them, but that's definitely something that I would be encouraging like institutions to think about as well, like actually the impact that this can have on staff members, and that we'd really encourage it to be kind of seen as part of the working day, but also as something that people might need to have a bit of time out for after, a bit of kind of space for reflection or peer support, or you know, things like that as well. So yeah, I'm really glad that that question's in there, because I think it's a really kind of key part of any training, but particularly a training on gender-based violence, which can be very difficult.
Great, thanks. And people can just contact you. We'll give your email address and phone number at the end, but you're quite happy for people to get in touch with you if they're interested in the training.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, if anything that's been like anything I've spoken about today, you know, if people want to know more, they can absolutely get in contact with me. It might be a case that I put them kind of directly in contact with their local rape crisis centre if they have capacity to kind of take on the work. Otherwise, it'll be me kind of coordinating that in my post. But yeah, absolutely. Please feel free to share my email and information, and also like. For anybody listening, please feel free to get in touch. That is absolutely what I'm here for and what my role is. So any and all questions are welcome.
That's super. Thank you so much for taking the time, Niamh. It's been great.
Yes, thank you.
Really useful.
Thanks.